On the evening of May 6, 1910, a woman stood at the door of a dying man's bedroom and made a decision that no etiquette manual, no protocol officer, no precedent in the entire history of the British monarchy had ever prepared her to make. The man in the bed was her husband of 47 years. The woman she had summoned to stand beside her, the woman she now watched weeping over his pillows, was his mistress of 12 years. And the choice of whether to let that woman stay or to remove her, quietly, finally, with the full force of a queen's authority, that choice belonged to Alexandra alone. She waited, she watched. And then, when the king lost consciousness and the mistress's composure broke entirely, Alexandra leaned toward the physician and said, in a voice that carried no heat, "Get that woman away." Not with cruelty, not with triumph, with the calm of someone who had been waiting a very long time to say something so small. This is the story of Queen Alexandra of Denmark, the most admired woman in Edwardian England, the most publicly celebrated consort of her age, and perhaps the most privately wounded. Welcome. She was born on the 1st of December 1844 in a townhouse beside the Amalienborg Palace in Copenhagen, a place known as the Yellow Palace. Though palace was a generous word for it, the building was elegant enough from the street, its pale facade facing a square, but inside it was the home of a family that had, for generations, hovered just at the edge of royal significance without quite arriving there. Her father, Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg, held a commission in the Danish army. His income from that post ran to roughly £800 a year. The children shared bedrooms. Alexandra, called Alex by everyone who loved her, shared hers with her sister Dagmar, the two of them in a small, barely furnished room in the upper floor of the building, which in winter was genuinely cold. They made their own clothes. They set the table. Their mother, Princess Louise of Hesse-Kassel, ran the household with the quiet practicality of a woman who understood that dignity did not depend on abundance. On certain evenings, Hans Christian Andersen, a family friend and occasional visitor, would sit with the children before bed and tell them stories. It is one of those biographical details that seems too symmetrical to be true, and yet it is documented. The future Queen of England grew up being read fairy tales by their author. Alex was the eldest daughter of 6 children, 4 of whom would eventually sit on European thrones. Her brother William would become King of Greece. Her sister Dagmar would become Empress of Russia. The family's elevation had not yet happened when Alex was a girl. It came in 1852 when a succession crisis in Denmark reached across the continent and settled improbably on her father as heir apparent. He would become King Christian IX, but that was still years away, and until then the children lived in the Yellow Palace, with its draughty rooms and its intimacy, and its evenings that smelled of candle wax and darned wool. What the family had in place of money was warmth. And what Alex had in addition to warmth was beauty. Even as a young girl it was striking. The blue eyes, the light brown hair, the particular quality of her presence that made people feel, when she entered a room, that the room had improved. She was impulsive and affectionate, and in ways that would only become clear later, already practicing the art of concealment. She had a small scar on her neck from childhood, of uncertain origin, and she had begun to wear her collars high to cover it. She had also been born with the early signs of a hereditary deafness, otosclerosis, a gradual calcification of the bones of the inner ear, that she was already learning to navigate with a particular attentiveness of expression, a watchfulness about the faces of the people speaking to her, a talent for appearing to hear everything, even when she heard very little. She was 16 when she was first placed on a list, across the North Sea, in a palace whose proportions bore no resemblance whatsoever to the Yellow Palace. A young man named Albert Edward was causing his mother considerable distress. He was the Prince of Wales, the son and heir of Queen Victoria, and he was 20 years old, charming, sociable, and already acquiring the reputation for romantic indiscretion that would define the next half-century of his life. His mother had called him irresponsible. His father, Prince Albert, had called him worse. His tutors had despaired. His parents had tried everything: rigorous education, military postings, close supervision, and nothing had substantially altered the character of a man who was, at his core, a sensualist. He liked food, he liked cards, he liked women. He was extremely good company and entirely unwilling to be governed. What he needed, his parents decided, was a wife. Queen Victoria and her daughter, the Crown Princess of Prussia, began drawing up lists of eligible Protestant princesses. The requirements were exacting. She had to be beautiful, dignified, cheerful, and suitable. She had to be, above all things, the sort of woman who could absorb a great deal without breaking. Alexandra of Denmark appeared on the list fifth. Within a year she had risen to the top of it. When they met for the first time, in the autumn of 1861, the prince was captivated. This is the part of the story that gets told as a romance, and in certain respects it deserves to be. He was genuinely moved by her, genuinely drawn to something in her that went beyond the obvious beauty. But it is also true that Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, had been captivated before, and would be again, and that his capacity for captivation was not the same thing as his capacity for faithfulness. These were separate compartments of his nature, and they would remain so for the rest of his life. He proposed in September 1862. She accepted. She was 17 years old. Queen Victoria, when she finally met Alexandra, described her as one of the most charming young women she had ever encountered. This was not an easy compliment for Victoria to give. She was not naturally generous with her approval, least of all toward women who might overshadow her own children. But Alexandra had a quality that disarmed even the most guarded observer. She was genuinely kind, in the uncalculated way of someone who has never found it necessary to be otherwise. Her warmth was not a performance, it was simply who she was. The wedding took place on the 10th of March, 1863, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Alexandra wore a gown of white silk with a silver train. The crowds along the route were extraordinary. People had come from across the country to see her, and she did not disappoint them. She smiled, she waved, she seemed to take genuine pleasure in the attention rather than merely enduring it. The poet laureate Alfred Tennyson wrote of her arrival in England as the Sea King's daughter from over the sea. The press called her the most beautiful woman in Europe. The public simply adored her. She was 18 years old, and she did not yet know what she had married into. The first years were, in the telling of those who knew the couple, genuinely happy. They set up their principal home at Marlborough House in London and at Sandringham in Norfolk. Sandringham having been purchased for them by Queen Victoria, a red brick estate with enough land for shooting parties and enough distance from court to feel, occasionally, like a private life. Alex loved Sandringham. She filled it with dogs. She had a particular weakness for the small, silky-eared dogs that would follow her everywhere, and with the noise and disorder of a household that she ran with a cheerful informality that scandalized the more rigid members of the royal household. Meals were late, clocks were adjusted. The Princess of Wales kept her own time and made no apologies for it. Children came quickly. Prince Albert Victor in 1864, Prince George in 1865, Princess Louise in 1867, Princess Victoria in 1868, Princess Maud in 1869. The sixth child, Alexander John, was born in 1871 and lived only one day. Alexandra buried him in a tiny coffin at Sandringham, and the dogs were not taken from the room, and no protocol was observed that was not her own. But it was 1867 that changed her body permanently. The birth of Princess Louise was followed by a violent illness. Rheumatic fever, the physician said, though some later suggested it might have been polio. The pain was excruciating and lasted for months. When Alexandra finally recovered and learned to walk again, she did so with a stiffness in one leg that would never fully resolve. She developed a particular gait, a slight, barely perceptible irregularity in her step, that she carried for the rest of her life. And then the most Edwardian of things happened. The women of fashionable London began to imitate it. They adopted what the newspapers called the Alexandra limp, some even ordering pairs of shoes with heels of different heights to approximate her gait. Shoemakers advertised. The Dundee Courier expressed disapproval. Alexandra said nothing on record about any of it. She had already learned, quite young, that silence was a form of power, and that the best way to retain dignity was to give no indication of what it cost. The high collars she wore, the stacked rows of choker necklaces, the velvet bands at the throat, the standing lace that she made fashionable across 2 continents, those too were concealment. Women copied them because they looked regal. They were regal, they were also a curtain. Beneath them always the scar. What the women who copied her did not know, and what she never told them, was that the beauty they were imitating had been constructed in part from the materials of private pain. This was Alexandra's particular genius. She could make her suffering look like style. By the mid-1870s, the shape of the marriage had become clear to anyone paying close enough attention. And in court circles, everyone was always paying close attention. Bertie, as the prince was known to family and intimates, was not a faithful man. He had never pretended to be. His affairs were an open secret of the kind that Victorian and Edwardian society maintained with extraordinary collective discipline, acknowledged privately, never spoken of in print, never raised in polite company, never officially confirmed. The rules were ironclad, and everyone understood them. Alexandra understood them too, whether she had been told explicitly before her marriage, or whether she came to understand through the slow accumulation of evidence. A wife's particular education is not entirely clear from the historical record. What is clear is that she chose, quite deliberately, not to let it destroy her. She accepted invitations on her own. She travelled with her children. She filled Sandringham with friends, with animals, with the controlled warmth of a woman who had decided that her happiness would not be contingent on her husband's behaviour. He was not without genuine feeling for her. Bertie was not a cold man. He was, in many ways, a warm and generous one, tender with people he loved, loyal to his friends, genuinely fond of his wife, even as he was constitutionally incapable of confining himself to her. This is the cruelest kind of infidelity, not the kind that comes from indifference, but the kind that coexists improbably with affection. He could adore her and betray her simultaneously, and he did for decades without apparent contradiction. His first serious public attachment was to Lily Langtry, the actress from Jersey, whom he met at a dinner in 1877. She was already famous, in fact, largely for her beauty, which was of the bold and uncomplicated kind that Bertie preferred. Their relationship became London's most discussed open secret. Lily was received in society. She was invited to houses where the prince would also be invited. The wives knew, the husbands knew, the newspapers knew and said nothing. Alexandra maintained her composure throughout, with what one observer described as a dignity that made everyone else feel small. After Lily Langtry came Daisy Greville, the Countess of Warwick. After Daisy came others. And then in 1898 came Alice Keppel. Alice was 30 years old to Bertie's 56. She was the wife of the Honourable George Keppel, a pleasant and accommodating man who seemed genuinely untroubled by the situation. She was witty, warm, diplomatically astute, not simply a beautiful companion but an intelligent one, someone who could talk with ministers and ambassadors, and who understood, intuitively, how power operated and what it required. Many observers considered her, in her way, the most capable political mind in Bertie's immediate circle. This was not an accident. Alice Keppel was not merely beloved by the future king, she was useful to him in ways that other women had not been. She was also, by general account, genuinely kind. And it was this, not the beauty, not even the intelligence, that Alexandra would later cite, in her own private fashion, as the reason she permitted the arrangement. She had seen enough of her husband's attachments to know when one of them contained something more durable than physical infatuation. Alice Keppel, Alexandra seemed to understand, would not be a passing season. She would be a permanent feature of the landscape. So Alexandra, with the particular pragmatism of a woman who has long ago decided what she will and will not be destroyed by, accommodated her. She did not like it. Let no reading of this moment suggest that she felt nothing. But she contained what she felt, as she had always contained it, behind the high collars and the steady eyes and the smile that the public saw and could not look behind. In January 1901, Queen Victoria died at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and Bertie became King Edward VII. He was 59 years old. He had waited so long for the throne that the waiting had become its own kind of career. He was now finally king. Alexandra became queen consort. She was 56, still extraordinarily beautiful, more deaf now than she had been, moving with the slight distinction of her limp through the corridors of Buckingham Palace. A palace she had not wanted to move into, had resisted with a stubbornness that briefly alarmed the household, had finally entered because there was no alternative. She preferred Sandringham. She always preferred Sandringham. The coronation was planned for June of 1902. It was postponed when Bertie collapsed with a severe case of appendicitis and required emergency surgery. He recovered, and the ceremony took place on the 9th of August instead, a detail that struck the newspapers as suitably Edwardian. Even the coronation could not be conducted on schedule because the king's health would not permit it, and because Edwardian England ran, ultimately, on the king's appetite for pleasure, and pleasure had its own timetable. Alexandra was crowned beside him. She wore the crown that Victoria had worn. She sat with the stillness of someone who had practiced stillness for 40 years, and no longer required effort to produce it. In the photographs, she looks serene. She looks like a woman who has arrived at last at the place she was always moving toward. What the photographs could not show was what had been given up in the getting there. The Edwardian court was, in many respects, built around Bertie's pleasures, and chief among those pleasures was the company of Alice Keppel. This was no longer a secret that required discretion. It was simply a fact that required management, and Alexandra managed it with the same expertise she brought to everything. Alice was received at court functions. She attended house parties where the Queen would also be present. The two women exchanged on certain occasions what witnesses described as perfectly civil greetings. What those witnesses were watching was not warmth. It was something else. A kind of formal acknowledgement, one woman to another, of the territory each occupied. Alexandra occupied the public ground. She carried the title, the crown, the children, the charity work, the hospital visits, the public grief and the public triumph. She was the face the empire saw. Alice occupied the private ground, the evenings, the travels, the intimate conversations, the part of Bertie's life where he was not king but simply Bertie, overindulged and affectionate and in need of comfort. The power did not belong entirely to the king. It was distributed between the two women who decided, each in her own domain, what he was permitted to be. Alexandra's domain was vast. She had founded the Imperial Military Nursing Service in 1902 and instituted Alexandra Rose Day, an annual hospital charity, in 1912. She visited the sick in hospitals in a manner that was, for the era, startlingly direct. She sat with patients. She held their hands. She listened to them with the particular attentiveness of someone whose own hearing required her to watch every face carefully, to give total attention, to be present in a way that many healthy people managed only in their most deliberate moments. She had turned quietly her disability into a form of grace. At Sandringham, she kept her dogs and her photographs. She had acquired one of the earliest portable Kodak cameras and had become a serious photographer of her family and household, capturing the informal life that official portraits could never show. The albums she assembled were dense with children on lawns, with dogs in doorways, with the casual evidence of a domestic world that she had built and maintained against considerable odds. Those albums sat year by year in their places on the shelves at Sandringham, next to the choker necklaces in their velvet boxes, next to the pressed flowers and the letters in their folders, the archive of a private life. Her children had become her primary attachment. She held them as she held everything she loved, with a tenacity that occasionally shaded into something more difficult. She called them to her side. She was reluctant to encourage their independence. Her daughters in particular, Louise, Victoria, Maud, spent years in a state of gentle captivity, unable to be entirely free of their mother's loving orbit. Princess Victoria never married at all, remaining at Alexandra's side as companion and secretary well into middle age. Whether this was freely chosen is one of those questions the historical record cannot entirely answer. Her eldest son, Albert Victor Eddie, they called him, died in January 1892 of influenza at the age of 28. He had been engaged to be married. His fiancée, Princess May of Teck, would instead marry his younger brother George, who thus became heir to the throne. Alexandra's grief over Eddie was enormous and lasting. She kept his room at Sandringham exactly as it was. She spoke of him in letters for the rest of her life with the present tense of a mother, who cannot accept that a child has fully stopped. The room stayed preserved, unchanged, the way the rooms of the deeply grieved always stay, as if the walls could hold something that the heart cannot afford to release. The choker she wore most often in the years after Eddie's death was a dark one. Observers noted the change. She said nothing about it. By 1909, the years were beginning to show on Bertie in a way that even his considerable appetite for life could not conceal. He had always been a heavy man, heavy in his appetites, in his physical frame, in the demands he made on himself and his body. He smoked enormously, ate extensively, and exercised very little, which in an earlier century would simply have been described as kingly. He had begun to suffer from bronchitis. His breathing was difficult. In February of 1909, he briefly lost consciousness during a state visit and was revived without much public acknowledgement. In March of 1910, on a diplomatic trip to France, he collapsed entirely and was confined to a protracted convalescence before he could return to England. It was in Biarritz, on that French trip, that he had been staying with Alice Keppel. She had watched him deteriorate with the particular grief of someone who knows a person's body too well to pretend. She sent him home. It was by several accounts the last time she felt in control of anything. Alexandra, meanwhile, had been in Corfu, visiting her brother King George of Greece. A telegram reached her there in late April. The king was seriously ill. She returned to Buckingham Palace on the 5th of May 1910. She arrived to find a man she barely recognized. He was seated because he refused to lie down. He had already said that he would not give in, that he would work to the end, the words of a man who understands that lying down is a kind of dying and is unwilling to begin it before he must. He was grey, he was struggling to breathe. Between periods of faintness, he received his son and heir. He spoke briefly about a horse that had won at Kempton Park that afternoon and expressed satisfaction at the result. He had always loved his horses. Then he lost consciousness and he did not regain it. At some point in those hours, the precise timing is disputed, and the accounts given afterward by different parties conflict in ways that reflect the different interests of those telling the stories. Alexandra made her decision regarding Alice Keppel. Some sources suggest that Bertie himself had asked for Alice to be present. Others suggest that Alexandra initiated the summons independently, out of some complex mixture of grace and control that only she could fully account for. What is not disputed is the outcome. Alice came. She was, by witnesses' descriptions, not composed. She was weeping. She was a woman who had loved this man for 12 years and who was watching him die in a room that was not, by any legal or ceremonial definition, her room, in a bed that was not her bed, beside a woman who had every right to ask her to leave. Alexandra let her stay while the king was still conscious. This was the act of grace. This was the part of the story that Alice Keppel would later tell and embellish in her own account of the evening, that Alexandra had wept with her, had embraced her, had promised that the royal family would care for Alice in the years to come. Historians who have examined this account with care have found it unlikely. Alexandra was not, in the evidence we have, a woman who wept in front of her rivals. She was a woman who waited. And then the king lost consciousness, and the woman at the bedside began to break. "Get that woman away," said quietly, said to the physician, with the finality of someone who has been patient for a very long time and is patient no longer. Alice Keppel was removed. She did not go easily. She was, by several accounts, crying audibly, what some present described as the grief of total exposure. A woman who had existed for 12 years in a world of polite mutual pretense, and now the pretense was over, and there was nothing left to soften the fact of who she was and what she had lost. Bertie died on the 6th of May 1910 at 11:30 in the evening. He was 68 years old. Alexandra sat with him afterward. She arranged his hands. She stayed with him in the room for a long time before she allowed anyone else in. Later, when told that she was now the Queen Dowager, that the title had shifted, that the reign had ended, she is reported to have said quietly, "Now at least I know where he is." There is no single sentence in the entire record of her life that contains so much relief, grief, the exhaustion of 47 years of not knowing and not asking and not being told. And underneath it, something that was neither bitterness nor forgiveness, but something older and more complicated than either. The knowledge of a woman who had loved a man fully and imperfectly, and for far too long to begin simplifying him now. Alice Keppel left England. She and her husband George sold their house and travelled abroad for 2 years, to the Far East, to places where no one knew who she was or who she had been. When they returned, they bought a new house in Grosvenor Street and built, quietly, a different kind of life. Alice would live until 1947. She never spoke publicly about the king's final hours, in terms that did not credit Alexandra with enormous dignity. Whatever else passed between them in that room, Alice seemed to understand what the Queen had given her and what she had taken away. Alexandra settled into widowhood with a refusal to cede the spaces she had occupied. She was reluctant for months to give Buckingham Palace over to her son George V and his wife Mary. She had lived long enough as Princess of Wales, waiting for a throne that arrived too late, to have developed a complex relationship with the idea of relinquishment. She returned eventually to Sandringham, where the albums were, and the dogs, and Eddie's unchanged room, and the familiar light of the Norfolk mornings coming through windows she had looked out of for 50 years. She helped her sister, the Dowager Empress of Russia, her Dagmar, the girl who had shared the cold attic room in the Yellow Palace, find refuge in England after the revolution consumed the Russian court. Dagmar had lost her son, the Tsar Nicholas II, to a Bolshevik firing squad. She had lost everything. Alexandra brought her to Denmark and then to England, and then, in the years that remained, held her as close as geography and logistics allowed. The two sisters had shared a room as children, and now they shared the wreckage of an era, and found in each other something that the public grandeur of their lives had never given them. Someone who knew exactly who they had been before any of it began. Alexandra's deafness grew worse in the years after Bertie's death. The social isolation that deafness brings, the particular loneliness of a room full of conversation from which you are quietly excluded, deepened with age. She had always used her watchfulness to compensate, reading faces and postures with the precision of someone who could not rely on words, but the effort was immense, and as she aged, she retreated more and more into the company of people she knew well enough not to require much conversation. Her daughter Victoria was almost always beside her, the dogs were always there. In her late 70s, she began to show signs of mild dementia. Those around her managed this with the same collective courtesy with which so many things in the long history of the British royal household had been managed, carefully, quietly, and without ever being stated outright. She died on the 20th of November 1925 at Sandringham House of a heart attack. She was 80 years old, 11 days short of her 81st birthday. Her cortege travelled to London through a snowstorm. People lined the route. At Westminster Abbey, her coffin lay beneath the great lantern tower near the high altar, and people filed through in extraordinary numbers to pay their respects to a woman whose life they had followed from a distance for more than 60 years. She was buried beside Bertie in the south aisle of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, a choice that was, presumably, her own. Beside him, after everything, beside him still. There is a question that a life like Alexandra's eventually forces upon anyone willing to look at it honestly. What do we call what she did? Was it endurance? Was it wisdom? Was it the trained incapacity to do otherwise, the submission of a woman who had no other options and found a way to call the cage a garden? All of these are possible. History does not give us access to the interior of the Yellow Palace, nor to the interior of Alexandra's mind during the decades she spent smiling at public functions while her husband dined in other rooms with other women. We have the photographs, those careful albums she assembled herself, the informal record of a life she controlled entirely. We have the dogs and the delayed clocks and the choker necklaces in their boxes. We have the letter she wrote after Eddie died, in which she described her grief with a plainness that made the reader feel, for a moment, the full weight of it. We have the words she said to the doctor at Bertie's bedside, and the other words she said when she learned she was a widow. What her story shows us is not that suffering ennobles. That is too convenient a lesson, and it lets the people who cause the suffering too far off the hook. What it shows us is something quieter and more durable, that certain people contain, within themselves, a capacity to remain themselves under conditions specifically designed to erase them, not because they are unfeeling, not because they do not notice, but because they have decided, at some fundamental level, that the self they are protecting is worth protecting, worth the cost, worth the effort, worth the long, exhausting discipline of the high collar and the still face and the daily performance of someone who has not been undone. She was photographed in her 70s, still wearing the choker necklaces, still covering the scar, still presenting to the world a surface of such perfection that most people never thought to wonder what lay beneath. And she had been wondered about. She had been adored, she had been analyzed, she had been imitated by women who copied her limp without knowing it was a limp. She made her suffering look like style, and in the making of it, she became something the court had not planned for when it selected her from a list of eligible Danish princesses. A woman who could not be reduced. When Bertie finally ran out of time, she was the one standing at the door. She was the one who decided who entered. She was the one who decided when the time had come to say, with all the accumulated authority of 47 years, enough. She had always known where the power was. She had simply waited, with extraordinary patience, for the moment to use it. If you'd like to see more stories of the women who were never meant to be remembered, we'd be glad to have you along.